Many parts of our daily life date back to the Roman Empire, even if we don't realize it. From the names of the planets in our solar system to modern roads and highways. So it would probably be smart to learn a bit about how the Roman Empire fell. This week's podcast helps us learn just that, but not in a boring history textbook sort of way, in an interesting and concise way. I'm Andy Smiley, the Friendly Podcast Guide. I'm a mom who has used podcasts to fight the boredom and loneliness of motherhood, and now I want to help you find a podcast that can do the same thing for you. It can be overwhelming to try and find a podcast you'll enjoy in the thousands of shows that are out there. That's where I come in. My episodes are short, and they answer all of the questions you'll have about the podcast, so you'll know if it's a good fit for you or not. I'm here to help you find a podcast you'll love without wasting your time. Now, let's talk podcasts. Nick Holmes, the host, describes his show like this. Ever wondered why the Roman Empire fell? Find out in this podcast from British historian Nick Holmes, as he tells the extraordinary story of Rome's decline and fall, and how its legacy is still central to the world we live in today. The length of each episode is 15 to 20 minutes. Like I said, it's concise. Before we learn about the vibe of today's podcast, we're going to take a quick break to talk about my podcast consultations. I've been able to talk to some amazing podcasters about their shows while doing interviews for the Friendly Podcast Guide. And along the way, I've learned so many tips and tricks on how to start a podcast from the hosts I've interviewed and from personal experience. I've talked to those hosts about what made their launch successful and what made it more difficult. And I for sure know what I would do differently if I could go back and launch my show again. And now I want to share my knowledge with you. I'm offering podcast consults, and I have a couple of spots open in the next month. If you need help nailing down your podcast idea, figuring out your niche, or you have any other podcast questions, I would love to work with you to make your show's launch the best it can be. If you're interested in working with me, fill out the intake form in the show notes. I can't wait to make a podcast plan that is tailored to you and your podcast, and will make your launch as smooth and successful as possible. Now we get to hear a clip from the fall of the Roman Empire to help you get a feel for the vibe of the show.
Hello and welcome to the Fall of the Roman Empire. My name is Nick Holmes, and if you're looking for a podcast about the Romans and why their empire fell, you've come to the right place. Let me kick off with a brief overview. This podcast will be weekly and about 20 minutes long. It'll be what I hope is an exciting narrative of Rome's decline and fall. If you've listened to my other podcast, which is called Byzantium and the Crusades, and by the way, if you did, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it, then you'll be familiar with the format, which is very straightforward and just about telling incredibly exciting history. What's so good about the story of Rome's fall is that it is one of the greatest stories in history. It's also one of the most important, in my view, because the legacy of the Roman Empire is still with us today in so many ways. For example, European languages use the Roman alphabet. Christianity was a Roman religion. Indeed, it became their state religion, very closely linked with the authority of the emperor. And a lot of the ideas we have today about government, politics, the army, as well as philosophy, art, drama, and literature come from the Romans, and as well as, of course, from the Greeks, since the Romans were great admirers of Greek civilization and adopted so much of it. So, enough of that introduction. Let's get on with some history. Now, I'm actually going to start at the very beginning of the story of the Roman Empire, because to understand how it fell, you really need to know what it was that fell. So, to start with, this will sound more like a history of Rome than the fall of Rome, but don't worry, we will soon get to the 3rd century and the massive crisis that the Romans faced then. So, let's start at the beginning. Rome began as a small settlement perched upon a few hills surrounding the river Tiber, about 15 miles from the sea. Its true origins will never be known for sure. Roman historians like Pliny and Virgil writing centuries afterwards embellished entirely fictional legends born centuries before they wrote them down. These legends appealed to the Romans as much as to us today. The most famous of all, of course, was that the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, abandoned at birth and suckled by a she-wolf, founded the city. Greek writers embellished this by linking the twins to the legend of Aeneas, a Trojan refugee who fled to Rome and married Lavinia, the daughter of the king of Latium, where Rome would later be founded, thereby romantically suggesting that Romans had Trojan blood in their veins. But what really happened? Archaeological evidence points to a native Italian settlement on the hills of ancient Rome in about 1000 BC. Roman historians...
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you know someone who could use the fall of the Roman Empire in their life, will you share this episode with them? Also, if you have the itch to start your own podcast, fill out the intake form in the show notes so I can help you make your podcast dreams come true. Talk to you soon.